Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 50, Syrian War Round 3. This week, we're going to continue our narrative and begin the Third Syrian War. This is our third conflict in Syria in just 3 generations, the first being under Antiochus I, the second under Antiochus II, and now the third under his son Seleucus II. As of our last episode, Berenike Syra and her son Antiochus the Unfortunate are both dead, and Ptolemy III has made his way into Seleucid territory. Let's see whether the Seleucids can turn it around. As an aside before we begin, I will say that the source material isn't supposedly terribly clear at this point. The deaths of Berenike and Antiochus were hidden in the city of Antioch, given that each side was afraid the other would conduct violent retribution. What we see here is 2 opposing camps, each worried that the other is going to spring into action if the news leaks out. Whether it leaked out or not, Antiochus the Unfortunate was dead after a very short, nominal reign. Gilbert in Lycia mentions him as a king, but Babylonian records never even touch upon him, and transition from King Antiochus II straight to Seleucus II. Both sides waited for their patrons to show up. Ptolemy III was the nearest one, and set up a staged ceremony inviting him into the city of Seleucia. He was helped in this regard by the fact that he had told everyone he was dropping by to see his sister. This ruse lowered resistance when he made his way to Antioch. In fact, Ptolemy III himself did not find out that his sister was dead until he got to the city of Antioch itself. Let's contrast for a moment between Ptolemy and Seleucus. Ptolemy III had been quick in arriving because he was closer by. Seleucus II couldn't get to the region fast enough and so had to depend on local support. Likely as not, Seleucus II or Laodike I used their local support to get rid of their 2 rivals. We don't know how much Seleucus would have known about the whereabouts of Ptolemy, but we know he couldn't have got there before his Egyptian counterpart. Seleucus and Laodike may have been banking on the idea that a quick end to the rival claimant to the throne would bring Syria back into line. However, Ptolemy III being present in the region upended the potential for this plan to come about. We don't know to what extent people bought the ruse of a fraternal visit from Ptolemy III, but once the deaths were revealed, Ptolemy needed a new excuse for being in the region. Speaking of this revelation, the fact that the deaths of Berenike Syra and Antiochus the Unfortunate were not common knowledge at first was helpful to the king of Egypt, because it bought him some time to bring reinforcements in from Syria. There were already soldiers in Phoenicia and Cyprus full-time at this point, and a few in the port settlements of Cilicia, meaning Ptolemy didn't need a lot of time to arrange this. While Berenike was being bumped off, Laodike was busy making her position stronger. Miletus declared for Seleucus, and we think a lot of the other Greek territories did the same. However, Ptolemy III struck like a hammer blow. It was eventually beneficial for Seleucus II and Laodike I to say that the 2 rivals were dead. However, by then, it was too late. The Third Syrian War can be divided into a marine and a terrestrial component, and the sea war was more crucial as the Ptolemies really excelled in this field. Bevan doesn't think the war is as bad as it's made out to be, and that we need to zoom in a little bit. After all, the Ptolemies only really made headway in places they could reach from the sea. However, as we will see, the Ptolemies still do plenty of damage. Ptolemy appeared in Syria, and was seen as a friend in a lot of places. According to Egyptian records, Ptolemy III was helped in his entrenchment in Syria by the surrender of regional government. Those who surrendered were likely as not thrown in jail, because their defections meant they couldn't be trusted. After all, if they could defect from one king's side, why not 2? Citadels would have been taken over by Egypt, with Seleucid soldiers having their weapons confiscated and their units being disbanded. There may have been a few who fled to stay loyal to Seleucus II. However, their king would have needed time to amass an army big enough to actually deal with the Ptolemies. Ptolemy essentially walked into northern Syria and right up to the Euphrates River. The Egyptian frontier now also extended to the Taurus Mountains, and Berenike's holdings in Cilicia grew. Ptolemy also took over the elephant park in Apamea, and the numbers there were bolstered with Egyptian African elephants. At this juncture, let's stop and talk for a minute about elephants in the Hellenistic world. The Ptolemaic dynasty was one of just 3 world powers to have systematically used African elephants in warfare, alongside the Belgians in the Congo and Carthage. The capabilities of elephants in this capacity had first been realized during the campaigns of Alexander the Great against the 200 elephants of the Indian king Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE. The Ptolemies got their elephants from around Eritrea and Ethiopia, with the elephants being moved to the coast and then by ship to Egypt. This tradition of elephant usage comes from Ptolemy I and Seleucus I, who had both looked to build a contingent of elephants in their armies, copying Alexander. Now, we're talking about both Indian and African elephants at this juncture. Why this dichotomy? Well, Ptolemy II had been faced with a problem. Namely, the Seleucids could replace their Indian war elephants via India, and replacement was more difficult for Egypt. Ptolemy II solved this in about 285 BCE by going after African elephants, most likely smaller forest elephants Loxodonta cyclotis, the smaller of the 2 African species. This is in contrast to Loxodonta africana, which lives on the savanna. Supposedly, this use by Ptolemy II is the beginning of African elephants being used in battle. As an aside, the only documented time when African elephants and Indian elephants fought against one another was the Battle of Rhaphis, as mentioned by the historian Polybius. This is still some way in the future for us in 173 BCE, when Ptolemy IV and Antiochus III face off against each other in the 4th Syrian War. Yes, you heard that correctly, the 4th. At least there's a good few decades before we get there. But back to the 3rd Syrian War, and indeed to another digression. Egypt had struck into Asia in a way much worse than the incursions of Thutmose. The source for this statement, Edwin Bevan, doesn't say which Thutmose this is, but I think this refers to Thutmose III. According to a chronology from 1951, he ruled between 1503 and 1449 BCE, or else 1479 to 1426 BCE according to Britannica, about 54 years in other words. Another chronology says he ruled at least 47 years, so the consensus seems to be round about half a century of rule. Thutmose III was a member of the 18th dynasty, which ruled Egypt between approximately 1587 BCE under Ahmose until 1337 BCE with the death of Horemheb. Horemheb is the last king of the 18th dynasty, but has been considered the founder of the 19th in the past, or even part of neither dynasty. The point here is not to make a definitive chronology of Egypt, but to introduce Thutmose III. Thutmose, sometimes called the best king of the 18th dynasty, was once held to be the brother of Thutmose II, we now know that he's his son, and at first he was overshadowed by his queen-regnant stepmother Hatshepsut. Entire books have been written about Thutmose III fighting in Asia and Syria to bring it back to the connection with the Third Syrian War. Thutmose fought 14 times in Asia, and he gave Egypt a prestige in Asia that supposedly never fully went away, and he may have even extracted tribute from Babylon. As a fun side note, we know from his mummy that he was 5'2" in height, or 157.48 centimeters. Anyway, back to his distant successor Ptolemy III. Ptolemy ruled supreme over the Lycian, Carian, and Phoenician coasts, controlling the Cyclades and Cyprus. He basically put the finishing touch to the effort of his predecessors. The work of Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II had now culminated in the efforts of Ptolemy III. Everything that had been surrendered recently, including Ephesus and the Cilician coastline, was retaken. Seleucid Thracian territories, which we last dealt with in episode 40, fell to Ptolemy. Let's discuss a letter sent by a Seleucid military officer discussing his exploits, which is discussed by Bevan in his 1902 House of Seleucus. The officer mentions that a town in Cilicia had a group of residents who struck up an agreement with the Ptolemaic army camped outside. The city was taken at night when the defenders weren't expecting it, and it was held by soldiers led by a man by the name of Epigenes. A bit later down the line, the text mentions 5 boats under the orders of Laodike I, hoarding coastal finances and putting them in Seleucia in Cilicia. They'd collected a fortune equal to 1,500 talents. Aribazos, the man running Cilicia, had the sole aim of bringing this money to Laodike over in Ephesus. However, he was thwarted by the defection of Soli and the governors who worked under him. Together with an Egyptian army under two men called Aristocles and Pythagoras, they assaulted the town. Both the town and its citadel were attacked, and Aribazos fled to the Taurus Mountains, where he was beheaded by locals and his head deposited at Antioch. Ptolemy also took over the Seleucid vessels, including those Berenike had employed. After Abydos fell, Egyptian coins were produced there for the first time. Finally, an Egyptian fleet travelled out, presumably from the Cypriot town of Salamis, and attacked Pisidium in Syria at 3 a.m. the following day. For reference, Pisidium is about 20 miles to the south of Seleucia. When the next day dawned properly, the fleet carried on to the aforementioned Seleucia and the populace welcomed them in. I think this is the arrival of Ptolemy III and his stage-managed invitation we talked about earlier in the episode. Moving onwards from Seleucia, the fleet travelled to Antioch, which was at that point still able to be reached from the water. That's where we'll leave it for today. Next time, we'll see in more detail what happens when Egypt's forces converge on Antioch. We'll continue our story of the Third Syrian War, and we'll see just how things went south for the Seleucids. I know we skipped over what happens to Antioch in this episode, but placing those events in the next episode ties in nicely with the theme of doom and gloom we established this episode as Ptolemy III gobbles up territory. That said, we will see Seleucus II still sitting pretty in Anatolia. Although there's a bit of a wobble, he will eventually march out to deal with the Egyptian invaders. If we have time, we might also see some divine retribution before Seleucus II finally manages to face off against Ptolemy III, courtesy of our ancient source Justinus. As a last note before I leave you today, it's worth noting that Rawlinson says this conflict is one of the 3 wars where Seleucus II meets with calamity. That should give you a bit of a feel for how the rest of the conflict is going to unfold. True, he is stated as mostly bouncing back from it, but it's an inauspicious sign to say the least. As always, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions, comments, or topic suggestions for future Tangent episodes. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.